The drifters saved her from a fire, then showed her the wanted poster with both their faces on it. The fire started like most troubles do, with a man who'd had too much whiskey and too little sense. Jacob McCreary sat in the corner of Bellwether's saloon, nursing his third glass of rotgut and watching the amber liquid catch the lamplight like liquid gold. Outside, Copper Falls was settling into another dusty evening, the kind where heat still rose from the earth long after the sun had crawled behind the mesa. The town was small enough that everyone knew everyone else's business, and everyone knew Jacob had been riding through for 3 days, paying for his drinks with silver that looked too clean for an honest man's pocket. The girl behind the bar, couldn't have been more than 16, kept her eyes down when she poured drinks. Her name was Sarah, though most folks just called her the orphan girl or Bellwether's ward. She'd been working in the saloon since her parents died in the cholera outbreak 2 summers back, sleeping in the storage room upstairs and earning her keep by sweeping floors and washing glasses. Her hands were small but steady, and she had learned early that in a place where men came to forget their troubles, a smart girl made herself invisible. Jacob watched her move between the tables, how she stepped around the cowboys and miners without looking at their faces, how she collected empty bottles like she was gathering wildflowers instead of cleaning up after drunks. There was something about her careful movements that reminded him of his sister back in Kansas, the sister he hadn't seen in 7 years, the sister who probably thought he was dead. The trouble started when Ned Patterson stumbled in from the street, his clothes reeking of horse sweat and his eyes wild with whatever demons had been chasing him across the territory. Ned was the kind of man who brought storms with him wherever he went, and tonight the storm was rage mixed with liquor and a gambling debt he couldn't pay. "Where's Bellwether?" Ned demanded, his voice cutting through the low conversations like a rusty blade. The saloon owner emerged from behind the bar, wiping his hands on a dirty apron. Tom Bellwether was a thick man with kind eyes who'd built his business on the simple principle of letting men drink their sorrows without judgment. He'd taken Sarah in when she had nowhere else to go, and most folks respected him for it. "Evening, Ned," Bellwether said, his voice carefully neutral. "What can I do for you?" "You know damn well what you can do." Ned's hand rested on the grip of his pistol. "I need more time on that debt. Another week, maybe 2. Jacob had seen this scene play out in a dozen towns across 3 states. A man pushed too far, pride wounded, looking for someone to blame for the choices that had brought him low. In Ned's bloodshot eyes, Jacob could see the moment when talking would end and violence would begin. "Ned, we've talked about this," Bellwether said patiently. "You've had 6 months already. I can't keep carrying." The gunshot came so fast that most folks didn't realize what had happened until Bellwether was already falling. The bullet caught him in the chest, spinning him around before he collapsed behind the bar. Sarah screamed, a sound like glass breaking, and dropped the tray she'd been carrying. What happened next would stay with Jacob for the rest of his days, playing out in his dreams like a scene from hell. Ned, wild with panic and liquor, overturned a table that sent an oil lamp crashing to the floor. The flame caught the spilled whiskey, and in seconds the fire was crawling across the wooden planks like a living thing, hungry and fast. Men shouted and scrambled for the doors, but the fire spread faster than fear. The walls of the saloon were old pine, dry as kindling, and the flames climbed them like they had wings. Smoke filled the room, thick and black, turning the familiar space into a maze of confusion and terror. Through the chaos, Jacob saw Sarah. She was kneeling beside Bellwether, trying to stop the bleeding with her apron, her face streaked with tears and soot. The fire was already between her and the front door, and she didn't seem to understand that staying meant dying. Jacob had spent 7 years running from his past, 7 years avoiding the kind of choices that marked a man's soul. But watching that girl kneel beside the only person who'd ever shown her kindness, he felt something shift inside his chest, something that had been sleeping for so long he'd almost forgotten it was there. He moved without thinking, pushing through the smoke and flames like a man walking through water. The heat seared his lungs and singed his beard, but he kept moving until he reached her. She looked up at him with eyes wide with shock, and for a moment neither of them moved. "He's gone," Jacob said, his voice gentle despite the roar of flames around them. "We have to go now." Sarah shook her head, clutching Bellwether's bloody hand. "I can't leave him. He saved me and he'd want you to live," Jacob interrupted, reaching down to lift her to her feet. "That's what good men do. They save people." The ceiling beam above them groaned and cracked, sending a shower of sparks raining down. Jacob wrapped his coat around Sarah's shoulders and pulled her toward the back of the saloon, where a window looked out onto the alley. The glass shattered under his boot, and he lifted her through the opening before climbing out himself. Behind them, Bellwether's saloon collapsed in on itself with a sound like thunder, sending flames and sparks high into the desert sky. Sarah sobbed against his chest while he held her, both of them watching everything she'd known turn to ash and memory. They stood there in the alley as the town's bucket brigade fought the fire, as neighbors shouted for the doctor, as Ned Patterson's body was found among the burning timbers. Sarah's tears left clean tracks through the soot on her cheeks, and Jacob found himself thinking about redemption. How sometimes it comes not from forgiveness, but from a simple act of reaching out your hand when someone is falling. The fire burned for 3 hours before the men of Copper Falls finally contained it. By then, half the main street was gone, and with it any witnesses to what had really happened in those final moments before the flames took hold. In the morning, when the sheriff and the territorial marshal came asking questions, the story would already be changing, growing, becoming something larger and more terrible than the truth. But that was tomorrow's trouble. Tonight, Jacob McCreary held a frightened girl while town burned, and for the first time in 7 years, he felt like he might be more than just another drifter running from his ghosts. They walked away from Copper Falls as the sun rose, two figures moving slowly across the desert, their shadows long and thin behind them. Neither spoke about what they'd left behind or what waited ahead. Some conversations can only happen after the smoke clears and the heart remembers how to beat without fear. 3 days out from Copper Falls, Jacob found the cave. It wasn't much to look at, just a shallow hollow carved into the red rock by wind and time, hidden behind a curtain of juniper and sage. But it faced east toward the sunrise and had a spring that bubbled up from some deep place in the earth, clear and cold even in the heat of late summer. Most important, it was far enough from any trail that a man could rest without watching the horizon for dust clouds. Sarah hadn't spoken much since they'd left the burning town behind them. She rode the old mare Jacob had bought from a rancher 20 miles north of Copper Falls, her back straight and her eyes fixed on the empty country ahead. Sometimes he caught her touching the small bundle of belongings she'd salvaged from the fire, a few dresses, a worn Bible, and a photograph of her parents taken on their wedding day. The photograph was singed at the edges, but their faces were still clear, still smiling out at a future they'd never see. When Jacob dismounted and started gathering kindling for a fire, Sarah slid down from her horse without being asked. She learned quickly over the past 3 days how to hobble the horses so they wouldn't wander, how to find the best spots to fill their water bottles, how to move quietly through the brush so they wouldn't disturb the wildlife or leave obvious signs of their passage. "We'll stay here tonight," Jacob said, not looking at her directly. He'd been careful about that, giving her space, speaking gently, making sure she never felt cornered or afraid. He'd known too many men who took advantage of women with nowhere else to go, and the thought of becoming that kind of man made his stomach turn. Sarah nodded and began unpacking their few supplies. Her movements were efficient now, practiced. 3 days of trail life had burned away some of the softness that came from sleeping indoors and eating regular meals. Her hands, which had been pale and smooth from washing dishes, were already showing calluses from handling rope and leather. As the sun sank lower, painting the desert in shades of gold and purple, Jacob built a small fire in the back of the cave where the smoke would be hidden. Sarah sat across from him, mending a tear in her riding skirt with careful, tiny stitches. The silence between them had changed over the past few days, from the heavy quiet of shared trauma to something more comfortable, like two people who were learning they could trust each other with small things. "Your burns need tending," Sarah said suddenly, her voice soft but firm. It was the most she'd spoken since morning. Jacob looked down at his hands. The fire at Bellwether's had left angry red marks across his palms and forearms where he'd pushed through burning timber to reach her. He'd been ignoring the pain, the way a man learns to ignore most hurts when he's spent years on the trail. "They're healing fine," he said. "No, they're not." Sarah set down her sewing and moved around the fire to kneel beside him. "I help Doc Morrison sometimes when folks got burned or cut up. I know what infection looks like." Before he could protest, she'd taken his right hand in both of hers, turning it toward the firelight to examine the blistered skin. Her touch was gentle but sure, the way someone touches something precious that might break if handled roughly. "The creek water's cold," she said. "It'll help with the heat." She disappeared into the gathering darkness and returned with a pot full of spring water and strips of cloth torn from an old petticoat. Jacob watched her work, cleaning the burns with careful patience, her face serious in the firelight. When she wrapped his hands in the clean cloth, her fingers brushed against his wrists, and he felt something he hadn't felt in years, the simple comfort of being cared for by another human being. "Thank you," he said. Sarah sat back on her heels, studying her work. Mr. Bellwether used to say that when someone saves your life, you owe them whatever kindness you can give back. Her voice caught slightly on the saloon owner's name, but she kept going. "Seems like tending burns is a small payment for what you did." They ate their supper of cold beans and hardtack in comfortable quiet, listening to the night sounds of the desert, the distant yipping of coyotes, the soft hoot of an owl somewhere in the darkness, the whisper of wind through the sage. When a meal was finished and the fire had burned down to glowing coals, Jacob leaned back against the cave wall and looked up at the stars scattered across the clear sky like diamonds on black velvet. "My father taught me the constellations," he said, surprising himself by speaking. "Before the war, before everything went wrong. He said a man who could read the stars would never be truly lost." Sarah followed his gaze upward. "I don't know any of their names." "That one there," Jacob pointed to a cluster of stars in the northern sky. "That's the Great Bear. See how it looks like a giant ladle? And that bright star, the one that doesn't seem to move? That's the North Star. Sailors use it to find their way home." For the next hour, Jacob shared what his father had taught him, the stories behind the constellations, how to use them for navigation, how different stars rose and set with the changing seasons. Sarah listened with the intense attention of someone who'd been hungry for learning but never had anyone to teach her. She asked careful questions and repeated the names until she could point out Cassiopeia and Orion without help. "Why did you save me?" she asked suddenly, her voice barely above a whisper. Jacob was quiet for a long time, watching the coals pulse like a slow heartbeat. "I had a sister once," he said finally, "back in Kansas before I started running. She was about your age when I left home. I always wondered what happened to her, whether she was safe, whether she had someone to look out for her when things got bad. What were you running from?" The question hung in the air between them like smoke. Jacob had spent 7 years avoiding that particular truth, 7 years telling himself that the past didn't matter as long as he kept moving forward. But sitting in that cave with Sarah, her young face serious in the dying firelight, he felt the weight of all those unspoken words. "A mistake," he said at last. "A terrible mistake that cost good people their lives." Sarah nodded, as if she understood that some stories were too heavy to carry in words. "Maybe saving me was your chance to balance the scales." "Maybe," Jacob said, though he wasn't sure the scales of justice worked that way. "Or maybe I just couldn't watch someone else lose everything when I had the power to help." They settled down to sleep on opposite sides of the dying fire, wrapped in their blankets and listening to the night sounds of the desert. Sarah fell asleep quickly, exhausted by days of travel and the work of rebuilding her life from nothing. Jacob lay awake longer, staring up at the stars he'd learned to name as a boy, thinking about redemption and second chances and the strange ways that fate brings people together. He didn't know that 200 miles away, in the territorial capital, a newspaperman was already setting type for the morning edition. The story was simple and dramatic, the kind that sold papers and made careers. A drifter and a saloon girl, working together to burn down half of Copper Falls. murder and arson, with reward money that would tempt every bounty hunter between Denver and El Paso. By morning, their faces would be on wanted posters from here to the Mexican border, drawn from the frightened memories of witnesses who'd seen them through smoke and flame. Sarah's features would be harder than they really were, her innocent eyes made to look calculating and cold. Jacob's face would carry the scars of violence he'd never committed, making him appear more dangerous than any man had a right to be. But that was tomorrow's trouble, riding toward them on the morning wind. Tonight, in a cave that smelled of sage and old rain, two people who'd found each other in the worst of circumstances slept peacefully under a blanket of stars, dreaming of better days that might still be possible if they could stay ahead of the shadows that were already gathering behind them. Jacob saw the poster nailed to the hitching post outside Meredith's general store, flapping in the morning breeze like a wounded bird trying to fly. He'd ridden into Cedar Ridge alone, leaving Sarah with the horses in a grove of cottonwoods 2 miles outside town. They needed supplies, coffee, beans, ammunition, and Jacob had learned long ago that a man traveling with a young woman drew the kind of attention that led to questions he couldn't answer. Better to go into town alone, buy what they needed, and get back to the trail before anyone took too close a look at his face. But the face looking back at him from that poster was his own, captured in black ink and grim lines that made him appear harder than he'd ever felt. Beneath his portrait, another face stared out, Sarah's features drawn from frightened memory, her soft eyes made sharp and calculating, her mouth set in a line that suggested cruelty instead of the quiet kindness he'd come to know. Wanted for murder and arson, the bold letters proclaimed. 500 reward dead or alive. Jacob's hands shook as he tore the poster from the nail, the paper rough against his palms. $500 was more money than most men in this territory saw in 2 years. It was enough to make honest folks think twice about their Christian charity, enough to turn neighbors into bounty hunters. Hell of a thing, ain't it? Jacob spun around to find an old man in a battered hat watching him with curious eyes. The man's face was weathered like old leather, and he leaned heavily on a walking stick carved from mesquite wood. A deputy's star hung crooked on his vest, tarnished with age. "What's that?" Jacob managed, his voice steady despite the hammering of his heart. "That poster you're holding," the deputy said, nodding toward the paper in Jacob's hands. "Came in on yesterday's stage. Word is they burned down half of Copper Falls, killed old Tom Bellwether in cold blood. The girl there, she was in on it from the start. Pretty little thing, but you can see the devil in her eyes if you look close enough." Jacob looked down at Sarah's face on the wanted poster. The artist had given her a hard mouth and narrow eyes, transforming her gentle features into something calculating and cruel. It was like looking at a stranger wearing her face, a twisted reflection that turned kindness into cunning. "You ever see them around these parts?" the deputy asked, studying Jacob's face with the careful attention of a man who'd spent 40 years watching for lies. "No," Jacob said, folding the poster and slipping it into his coat pocket. "Can't say that I have." The deputy's eyes lingered on Jacob for a moment longer, and Jacob felt sweat gathering under his collar despite the cool morning air. Then the old man shrugged and turned away, his walking stick tapping against the wooden sidewalk as he made his way toward the saloon. "Well, keep your eyes open," the deputy called over his shoulder. $500 is a lot of money. Makes a man see things different, if you know what I mean. Jacob knew exactly what he meant. Inside the general store, Jacob moved quickly through his purchases, his mind racing while his hands gathered supplies with practiced efficiency. Coffee, beans, hardtack, ammunition for his rifle. Salt pork wrapped in brown paper. A new shirt for Sarah, since hers was getting worn from days on the trail. The store owner, a thin man with nervous eyes, tallied up the purchases without much conversation, though Jacob caught him glancing toward the window where more wanted posters had been pasted to the glass. "Terrible business up in Copper Falls," the store owner said as he counted out Jacob's change. "Makes a man think twice about who he lets into his place of business." "I imagine it does," Jacob replied, pocketing the coins and gathering his packages. As he stepped back onto the sidewalk, Jacob saw them. 3 men on horseback at the far end of the street, their eyes scanning the faces of everyone they passed. Bounty hunters, by the look of them. Hard men with cold eyes and guns that had seen too much use. One of them held a wanted poster in his gloved hand, comparing it to the faces in the crowd. Jacob forced himself to walk calmly to his horse, loading his supplies into the saddlebags with steady hands while his heart hammered against his ribs. The bounty hunters were working their way down the street, stopping to talk to shopkeepers and asking questions in voices too low to carry. It wouldn't be long before they reached the general store, before they started asking about strangers who'd been buying supplies. He mounted his horse and rode out of Cedar Ridge at an easy pace, fighting every instinct that told him to run. Running would draw attention, and attention was the last thing he needed. Behind him, the town went about its morning business, unaware that $500 in reward money had just slipped through their fingers. The ride back to the Cottonwood Grove felt like the longest 2 miles of Jacob's life. Every sound made him look over his shoulder. The cry of a hawk, the rustle of wind through the grass, the distant lowing of cattle. By the time he reached the trees where Sarah waited, his shirt was soaked with sweat and his hands were cramped from gripping the reins too tight. Sarah looked up from where she sat, braiding wildflowers into a chain, her face bright with the simple pleasure of having something beautiful to do with her hands. She found a clear pool in the creek and washed her hair, and it hung in damp waves around her shoulders, catching the sunlight like spun gold. For a moment, looking at her sitting there in the dappled shade, Jacob forgot about wanted posters and bounty hunters and the weight of guilt he'd been carrying for 7 years. Then reality crashed back like a cold wave. "We need to go," he said, dismounting and moving quickly to pack their gear. "Now!" Sarah rose to her feet, the flower chain falling forgotten to the ground. "What happened?" "Did someone just pack?" Jacob said, his voice sharper than he intended. "We'll talk on the trail." They broke camp in minutes, years of frontier living making them efficient at the business of survival. Sarah asked, no more questions, but Jacob could feel her watching him as they mounted their horses and headed south toward the broken country along the territorial border. Her trust in him was complete and unquestioning, and that made what he had to tell her even harder. They rode for 2 hours before Jacob found a place he felt safe enough to stop, a narrow canyon with walls high enough to hide them from casual observation. A thin stream ran along the bottom, and there was grass enough for the horses. Sarah dismounted and began unsaddling her mare without being asked, but her eyes never left Jacob's face. Finally, when the horses were watered and hobbled, Jacob pulled the wanted poster from his coat pocket and smoothed it out on a flat rock between them. Sarah stared down at the paper for a long time, her face very still. When she finally looked up, her eyes were bright with unshed tears. "That's not me," she said quietly. "That's not what I look like. I know. They made me look." She touched her face with one hand, as if checking to make sure her real features were still there. "They made me look cruel." Jacob nodded, unable to find words for the anger that was building in his chest. Anger at the witnesses who'd let fear twist their memories, at the artist who'd turned innocence into guilt with a few strokes of his pen, at himself for not seeing this coming. $500, Sarah said, reading the reward amount. "That's a lot of money." "Yes. People will hunt us for that much." "Yes." Sarah was quiet for a long time, staring down at the poster. A stray dog had wandered into their camp, thin and tired looking, and she tore off a piece of hardtack to feed it. The dog accepted the food gratefully, settling down near her feet as if it recognized kindness when it found it. "I never killed anybody," Sarah said finally. "I never even thought about hurting another person. But now everyone who sees this will think I'm a murderer." Jacob wanted to tell her it would be all right, that they could prove their innocence, that justice would find a way to set things right. But he'd been running from his own version of justice for 7 years, and he knew better than most how little the truth mattered when people needed someone to blame. "Sometimes," he said carefully, "the law and justice aren't the same thing." Sarah looked up at him, and in her eyes he saw the exact moment when her childhood ended. Not in the fire that had destroyed her home, not in the days of hard travel that had followed, but right here, staring down at a piece of paper that had transformed her from victim to villain with nothing more than ink and imagination. "What do we do now?" she asked. Jacob folded the wanted poster and tucked it back into his coat, but the weight of it seemed to settle into his bones, a reminder that some burdens, once taken up, could never be put down. The dog at Sarah's feet looked up at them both with trusting brown eyes, and Jacob found himself thinking about loyalty, how it bloomed in the strangest places between the most unlikely people. "We keep riding," he said, "and we learn to live with being the kind of people others are afraid of, whether we deserve it or not." The crossroads appeared at dawn like something from a dream, 3 dirt paths meeting in a place that belonged to no territory and answered to no law. Jacob and Sarah had been riding through the night, putting distance between themselves and the bounty hunters who'd been trailing them for the past week. Their horses were tired, their water was running low, and Sarah's face had taken on the lean, weathered look of someone who'd learned that survival was a daily choice, not a given right. The crossroads sat in a shallow valley, surrounded by red rock mesas that rose like ancient monuments to forgotten gods. One path led north toward Colorado and the mining camps where a person could disappear into crowds of drifters and fortune seekers. Another headed west toward California and the promise of gold fields where yesterday's sins mattered less than tomorrow's prospects. The third trail wound south into Mexico, where American law meant nothing and a new life could be bought with the right words and enough silver. Jacob dismounted and let his horse drink from a small spring that bubbled up from the rocks, clear water that tasted of minerals and deep earth. Sarah sat her saddle for a moment longer, looking down each of the 3 paths as if she could see the futures they offered stretching out like ghostly roads into the unknown. "This is it, isn't it?" she said finally, her voice carrying the weight of understanding. "This is where we decide who we're going to be." Jacob nodded, unable to trust his voice. Over the past 2 weeks, he'd watched Sarah transform from a frightened girl into something harder and more resilient. She'd learned to shoot his rifle with steady hands, to read the signs of weather and pursuit, to sleep light and wake silent. But more than that, she'd learned to carry the burden of being hunted, of having her face on wanted posters in every town between here and the Mississippi. The stray dog that had been following them since Cedar Ridge emerged from behind a boulder, limping slightly from a thorn in its paw that Sarah had doctored the night before. It had attached itself to them with the desperate loyalty of a creature that knew kindness when it found it, and Sarah had taken to sharing her meager meals with it despite Jacob's protests about wasting food. "He's not waste," she'd said one evening as the dog settled beside their fire. "He's hope. Hope that there's still good in the world worth protecting." Now the dog sat between them, panting softly in the growing heat of the day, its brown eyes moving from Sarah to Jacob as if it understood that something important was happening. Sarah dismounted and walked to the center of the crossroads, her boots raising small puffs of dust that caught the morning light. She'd grown taller somehow, or maybe it was just that she carried herself differently now, shoulders back, head high, like someone who'd learned that the world could try to break you, but couldn't succeed unless you let it. "I've been thinking," she said, not looking at either path, but staring straight ahead at the horizon where the sun was painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, "about what you said that first night about your sister in Kansas." Jacob felt his chest tighten. He'd told Sarah more about his past during their nights around campfires than he'd ever told another living soul. About the bank robbery that had gone wrong, about the innocent people who died because of his poor choices, about the 7 years he'd spent running from the memory of gunshots and screaming horses and a lawman's badge stained with blood. "What about her?" he asked. "You said you wondered if she was safe, if she had someone looking out for her." Sarah turned to face him, and in her eyes he saw a strength that reminded him of his sister, the same stubborn courage that had made Mary McCreary stand up to their drunken father, the same fierce loyalty that had made her try to talk Jacob out of riding with the Dalton gang all those years ago. "I do wonder," Jacob admitted. "Every day. Then maybe it's time to stop wondering." Sarah pulled something from her coat pocket, a letter worn soft from handling. "I wrote this last night while you were sleeping. It's to the postmaster in Cedar Ridge, asking him to send word to the territorial marshal's office in Topeka, asking them to find Mary McCreary and tell her that her brother is alive. Jacob stared at the letter, his hands trembling slightly. "Sarah, if they trace that back to us, they won't," she said firmly, "because we're not going to be here for them to find. We're going south, Jacob, into Mexico, where wanted posters don't mean anything and a man can start over with a new name and a clean slate." The dog whined softly, sensing the tension in the air. Sarah reached down to scratch behind its ears, her touch gentle despite the hardness that life had forced into her features. "But first," she continued, "you're going to mail that letter. You're going to let your sister know that you're alive, that you think about her, that you're sorry for the choices that took you away from her. Because some debts can't be paid with running, Jacob. Some things you have to face before you can truly be free." Jacob looked down at the letter in her hands, thinking about forgiveness and redemption and the strange ways that grace could appear in the most unlikely places. A month ago, he'd been a drifter with no purpose beyond staying ahead of his past. Now he was responsible for another person's life, another person's future, another person's hope for something better than the cards fate had dealt them. "And what about you?" he asked. "What about your future?" Sarah smiled, and for a moment she looked like the young girl he'd pulled from the burning saloon, innocent and full of dreams. But when she spoke, her voice carried the wisdom of someone who'd learned that happiness wasn't something you found, but something you chose to create. "I'm going to raise horses," she said. "In Mexico, where the grass grows green and the law doesn't ask too many questions about where people come from. I'm going to build something good with these hands, something that helps instead of hurts. And maybe someday, when enough years have passed and the world has forgotten about that wanted poster, I'll come back and visit Tom Bellwether's grave and tell him that the girl he saved turned out all right after all." The sun was fully up now, casting long shadows across the desert floor. In the distance, Jacob could see dust clouds on the northern horizon, riders moving fast, probably the bounty hunters who'd been tracking them. They had maybe an hour before those riders reached the crossroads, maybe less if they were pushing their horses hard. Jacob took the letter from Sarah's hands and tucked it into his saddlebag. "There's a trading post about 10 miles north of here," he said. "They'll have a postal box. I could drop this off and be back before those riders get close." "We'll be waiting," Sarah said, settling down beside the spring with the dog curled up next to her. "Won't we, boy?" The dog thumped its tail against the ground, and Jacob found himself smiling despite everything. They were outlaws now, fugitives with prices on their heads, but sitting there in a morning sun with a loyal dog and a woman who'd learned to find hope in the darkest places, he felt something he hadn't felt in 7 years. He felt like he was finally heading home. The ride to the trading post took him through country that reminded him of Kansas. Rolling hills covered in buffalo grass, with creeks that ran clear and cottonwoods that offered shade from the relentless sun. The trading post was a ramshackle building run by an old Mexican man who asked no questions and accepted Jacob's coins without looking too closely at his face. When Jacob dropped the letter into the postal box, he felt a weight lift from his shoulders that he'd been carrying so long he'd forgotten it was there. Somewhere in Kansas, his sister would learn that he was alive. She would know that he thought about her, that he was sorry, that he hoped she'd found the happiness that had always seemed just out of his reach. By the time he rode back to the crossroads, the dust clouds on the horizon had grown larger. Sarah was already mounted and ready to ride, their supplies packed, and the dog sitting alert beside her horse. "Ready?" she asked. Jacob looked back once at the path that led north, toward his old life and all the mistakes he could never undo. Then he turned his horse south, toward Mexico and the possibility of redemption, toward a future where a man could be judged by what he built rather than what he destroyed. "Ready," he said. They rode away from the crossroads as the morning heat began to shimmer off the desert floor, two figures moving steadily south with a faithful dog trotting alongside. Behind them, the dust clouds grew closer, but ahead lay open country and the promise of a new beginning. The desert would remember them, would remember their footprints in the sand, their campfires among the rocks, the sound of their voices calling to each other across the vast emptiness. but it would keep their secrets, as it had kept the secrets of countless others who'd passed this way seeking something better than what they'd left behind. Sometimes redemption comes not from forgiveness, but from the simple act of choosing to become someone worthy of the life you've been given. Sometimes salvation lies not in looking back, but in having the courage to ride toward tomorrow with your heart open to whatever grace might be waiting just beyond the horizon.